The moment Sergeant Major Dale Kowalski ripped the IV line from his arm and hurled a metal tray across the trauma bay, 3 security guards hit the door at a dead run. He was 6'2", 230 pounds of combat-hardened muscle, completely deaf, and absolutely convinced he was still in a firefight somewhere he couldn't name. Everyone in that hallway was certain this was going to end badly. And then a nurse nobody respected walked straight into the room alone, reached into her scrub pocket, and pulled out a whiteboard marker. No restraints, no sedatives, no backup. Just a woman the senior staff had spent 6 months trying to destroy, and a blank board she pressed slowly against the glass. Viewer CTA. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear is only the beginning. Every week, we bring you the kind of story that gets under your skin and stays there. Hit the like button if you want more, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Claire Donovan, because what happened next in that trauma bay changed everything. Vance Memorial Military Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Delwood, Montana, where the winters came early and stayed mean, and where the hospital's reputation for treating active duty and veteran patients drew some of the most complicated trauma cases in the Pacific Northwest corridor. The building itself was a converted military facility, wide corridors, fluorescent lighting that never quite softened, and a trauma wing that ran 24 hours at a pace that chewed through nurses the way a paper shredder chewed through documents. Claire Donovan had been working there for 8 months. She was 31 years old, medium height, brown hair she kept clipped back with the kind of efficiency that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with practicality. She had a way of moving through the unit that didn't call attention to itself, deliberate without being slow, quiet without being timid. The kind of stillness that people mistook for passivity until they'd watched her work a full shift. Most of the senior staff had made that mistake. Several of them were still making it. "She talks to them too much," charge nurse Renata Foss told the unit manager the first week Claire arrived. Renata was 44, had been running the trauma floor for 11 years, and viewed the unit the way a general views a battlefield, with absolute authority and zero tolerance for deviation from her preferred order of operations. "We don't have time for hand-holding. You move, you stabilize, you document, you move again. That's how this floor works." The unit manager, a quiet man named Gerald Pham, who spent most of his time avoiding conflict, had nodded and said he'd keep an eye on it. Renata had taken that as permission to keep an eye on Claire herself. It started small. The shift assignments that put Claire on the lowest acuity cases, while less experienced nurses handled trauma intake. The supply cabinet that seemed perpetually short of what Claire had requisitioned. The mandatory in-service sessions scheduled on Claire's days off, then logged as absences when she missed them. Little mechanisms of institutional friction applied with precision. What Renata didn't understand, and what nobody on that floor had bothered to find out, was that Claire Donovan had spent 4 years as a combat medic attached to a forward operating base in a region where the nearest surgical facility was a 40-minute helicopter ride on a good day. She had triaged casualties in conditions that would have shut down most civilian ERs. She had kept men alive in the dirt with equipment that fit in a pack on her back. She wasn't slow, she wasn't soft. She was reading every patient she encountered and making calculated decisions that the people watching her couldn't follow because they didn't know the framework she was using. But she hadn't told anyone that. She'd listed her military service on her application, checked the box for prior trauma experience, and left it at that. She wasn't the kind of person who led with her resume. She'd learned in the years since she'd left the service that explaining yourself to people who'd already decided what you were was a waste of breath that was better spent on the patient in front of you. So she kept her head down and did her job, and she let Renata Foss believe whatever Renata Foss needed to believe. The morning of March 4th started like every other Tuesday in Delwood. Gray sky pressing down on the parking lot, a wind that came off the mountains with an edge to it, the kind of cold that found the gap between your collar and your neck no matter how you bundled. Claire arrived 20 minutes before her shift, changed, checked the board, and took her assignment from the overnight charge. 3 stable post-op patients, a veteran in for wound management, a routine intake from the previous evening that needed morning labs. Standard, manageable. The kind of shift that would have felt like a gift 6 months ago, when she was still figuring out the unit's rhythms. She was 2 hours into it when the ambulance bay doors opened and everything changed. She heard it before she saw it. The particular quality of chaos that comes not from a code, but from people responding to something they don't know how to handle. Raised voices. Not urgent in the clinical sense, but rattled. That distinct register of medical professionals who've encountered something outside their training parameters. She finished hanging the IV bag she was working on, told her patient she'd be back in 10, and walked to the doorway of the corridor. The trauma bay at the end of the hall had its doors open. Through the gap, she could see 2 nurses against the far wall, a physician with his hands raised in a placating gesture, and a man on the gurney who was very clearly not staying on it. He was big, military bearing even in a hospital gown, even with wound dressings covering most of his left side. His movements had a kind of coiled economy to them that Claire recognized. The body's automatic response to threat, trained so deep it fired on its own whether the threat was real or not. His face was absolutely locked in an expression she'd seen before. In a different context, in a different world. He wasn't seeing the trauma bay. She watched him sweep the IV pole off its mount and understood 2 things simultaneously. That someone was going to get hurt if this continued the way it was going, and that the way it was going was entirely wrong. She was already moving down the corridor when Renata Foss stepped out of the nursing station directly into her path. "Where do you think you're going?" "Trauma Bay 1. That's not your patient, and it's not your call." Renata's voice had the flat authority of someone who had never once doubted whether their authority applied. "Security is on the way. Stand down." Claire looked at the trauma bay doors. One of the nurses had backed out into the corridor. The physician was retreating toward the supply cart. "Someone's going to get hurt," Claire said. "I said stand down, Donovan." Renata stepped sideways, actually blocking her path with her body. "You want to play hero, do it on your own time. On my unit, you follow procedure." "What procedure?" Claire said, keeping her voice level. "There's no procedure on that board for a deaf trauma patient in acute stress response. I checked when I started here." The word deaf landed. She watched it register on Renata's face. The slight shift, the brief hesitation that confirmed what Claire had already read from the chart flag she'd noticed when the ambulance crew logged the intake. The patient was deaf. Profoundly so, according to the notation. And the team in that room was shouting at him. They were shouting at a man who couldn't hear them, who had combat trauma in his history, who was surrounded by strangers in an unfamiliar space, and had no way of understanding what was happening to him. Every instinct trained into him was telling him he was in danger, because every signal his environment was sending him confirmed it. "The chart says," Renata started, "the chart says he's a Navy Master Chief with a documented history of combat-related PTSD and bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. It does not say anyone in that room knows how to communicate with him." Claire paused. "I do. Move." It was the first time she had ever spoken to Renata Foss that way. She watched the older nurse's expression harden into something that was half authority and half genuine shock. "You're done," Renata said quietly. "After this shift, you're done." "Okay," Claire said, and walked around her. She pushed through the trauma bay doors without stopping, moved past the retreating physician with a brief, "I need the room quieter, not louder," and reached the supply cart along the near wall. The Master Chief had the IV pole in both hands by that point. He was in a corner of the bay, back to the wall, which told her everything she needed to know about his current mental state. His breathing was visible from across the room. His eyes were tracking everything, fast and reactive, the way eyes moved when they were looking for threats and finding them everywhere. She found the dry erase board on the second shelf. She'd noticed it her first week, the way you cataloged equipment in unfamiliar environments. It was a standard patient communication board, 12 by 16 inches, designed for laryngectomy patients. The marker was clipped to the frame. She uncapped the marker. She did not approach him. She positioned herself at the outer edge of his visual field, close enough to be seen, far enough to signal she wasn't moving in, and held the board where he could read it. She wrote slowly, deliberately, making sure each letter was legible. "My name is Claire. I'm a nurse. You are safe." He saw it. She watched his eyes lock onto the board, watched the frantic scanning pause for 1 second. His grip on the IV pole didn't loosen, but the movement stopped. She wrote again. You're in a hospital, Delwood, Montana. The date is March 4. Grounding information. Date, location, context. The 3 pillars of orienting someone who'd slipped out of the present. Behind her, she was aware of the physician still in the room, one of the nurses hovering near the door. She kept her body angled toward the Master Chief and her voice, when she spoke to the room, low and without urgency. Everyone needs to stay very still and very quiet. No sudden movements. If you need to leave the room, do it slowly. She heard footsteps as someone went out. She turned the board back to the patient. I won't touch you or come closer until you tell me it's okay. He stared at that for what felt like a long time. In reality, it was probably 20 seconds. Then, slowly, his chin dropped about an inch. Not a nod exactly, but an acknowledgement. She wrote, What's your name? Another long pause. Then he set the IV pole down, carefully, not dropped, and looked at her hands. She realized he was looking to see if she was going to move. She stayed exactly where she was. He held up 3 fingers on his right hand, then touched his chest. She wrote, 3 fingers. Your name has 3 letters? He shook his head, touched his chest again, then tapped the side of his head twice. She thought about it for a moment, then wrote, Are you telling me your rank? The faintest thing moved across his face, not a smile, but the corner of his mouth shifted in a way that communicated something like, close enough. She wrote, Master Chief. He touched his chest again, and this time, with his other hand, pointed at her board. She wrote, I see you. Master Chief, I understand. And something in his shoulders, some enormous, invisible weight, shifted, not gone, but redistributed. The way a loaded pack feels after you adjust the straps. Still heavy, but bearable. She wrote, Can I come 2 steps closer? He looked at her hands again, then at her face. He held up 1 finger. She took 1 step. He didn't move. She wrote, Thank you, your IV came out. I need to replace it. Is that okay? He looked at his arm, looked at the board, looked at her. Then, after a long moment, he moved away from the wall. That was the moment Renata Foss appeared in the doorway. Claire didn't turn around. She knew it was Renata because she heard the sound of a phone camera, which was so wildly inappropriate that it almost broke her focus. She managed to keep her attention on the patient. Don't, she said, loudly enough for the doorway, without turning. The camera sound stopped. She spent the next 40 minutes in that room. She replaced the IV with a running written commentary on each step. I'm going to find a vein on your left arm. This will pinch for 3 seconds. I'll show you on the board before I do anything. She did exactly what she said she would do, every time. Not because it was protocol, because she'd learned in circumstances she didn't talk about that trust was the only real painkiller for certain kinds of hurt. You couldn't pill your way out of the fear that you were about to be held down by people you couldn't hear. You had to build a thread of certainty, thin as wire, between yourself and the person on the other side of it. She built that thread 1 sentence at a time. When the attending physician came back 20 minutes later, Dr. Marcus Webb, a decent man who was clearly relieved not to be dealing with the immediate crisis, she briefed him in a low voice off to the side, enough distance that the patient could still see her hands but not read her lips if he wasn't focused on her. His chart flagged the hearing loss, but there's no communication protocol in the intake notes, she said. Whoever triaged him didn't have a plan for it. That's going to be a problem for the documentation review, Webb said, with the tone of someone who already knew exactly how much paperwork this morning had just generated. It's a problem for his care plan right now, she said. He's going to need written communication for everything, every procedure, every medication change, every time someone new comes into his room. If that doesn't happen, you're going to have another incident. Webb looked at the Master Chief, who was watching them both with an expression of alert attention, clearly reading the room even if he couldn't read their lips from that angle. Get me a formal recommendation in writing, Webb said. I'll back it. She nodded and went back to the patient. She was there long enough that her original 3 patients had been redistributed among the other nurses on the floor. She found out about this secondhand from a second-year nurse named Josie Tran, who stopped her in the corridor with an apologetic expression. "Renata reassigned them," Josie said. "She said you abandoned your assignment." "She'd say that," Claire said, and kept walking. She was writing up her incident notes at the nursing station when Renata appeared at her elbow. "I need your badge." Claire looked up. "HR wants to see you at 2, Renata said. Her voice had the careful neutrality of someone who'd already decided how this conversation ended. Abandonment of patient assignment, failure to follow a direct order from the charge nurse, and unauthorized entry into a trauma situation outside your scope. She paused. "You can leave your badge at the desk when you go in." Claire looked at her for a moment. "I didn't abandon my patients," she said. "You reassigned them." "That's not how the documentation reads." "Then the documentation is wrong." "You want to file a grievance? There's a form." Renata's expression didn't flicker. 2:00, HR, 3rd floor. Don't be late." She walked away. Claire turned back to her notes. She finished them. Every detail logged with the kind of precision that came from years of writing reports in conditions where accuracy was the difference between an after-action review and a tragedy. She noted the intake chart's missing communication protocol. She noted the absence of any deaf patient accommodation in the trauma bay procedure binder. She noted the timeline of events, including the time Renata Foss had physically blocked her access to the patient. She sent copies to 3 separate email addresses before she went upstairs. The HR office was a beige room on the 3rd floor with a small conference table, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out over the hospital parking garage. The HR representative was a woman named Sandra Oates, who had a folder in front of her that was thicker than it should have been for an 8-month employee. "We want to make this as straightforward as possible," Sandra said. "We have documented complaints from the charge nurse, a statement from the physician of record, and a formal incident report filed this morning." She pushed a single sheet of paper across the table. "This is a standard separation agreement. 3 weeks of severance, continuation of benefits through the end of the month." Claire looked at the paper without picking it up. "The physician of record is Dr. Marcus Webb," she said. "Did he write that statement, or was he asked to sign something that was written for him?" Sandra blinked. "I'm not in a position to—" "Because I have an email from Dr. Webb sent at 11:47 this morning asking me to submit a formal care recommendation for the patient in Trauma Bay 1. That's not consistent with a physician filing a complaint against me." A very brief silence. "The separation agreement. I'm not signing it," Claire said. "Ms. Donovan, I want to be clear about the situation. The complaint from the charge nurse is, the charge nurse physically blocked my access to a patient in acute distress," Claire said. "A deaf patient who had no communication accommodation in place, who was alone in a room with people shouting at him. I went in. He's stable now. Those are the facts." She pulled her own folder from her bag, a copy of her incident report, the email thread with Webb, and a 2-page summary of the care gaps she'd identified in the Trauma Bay documentation, and set it on the table. "I'm not resigning, and I'm not signing that agreement. If the hospital wants to terminate me, that's a decision someone above Sandra in HR is going to have to make, and they're going to want to read that first." She tapped the folder. "I'll be at the nursing station," she said. She walked out. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired in the specific way that came from fighting battles that shouldn't need fighting. The grinding exhaustion of having to justify competence to people who'd already written you off. She'd felt it before. In the service, when she was the only woman on a 6-person team and had to recalibrate every new senior NCO she worked under. In the civilian ER, where she'd worked before Vance, where a physician had flagged her pain assessment skills as too empathetic to be objective. She was good at the work. She had always been good at the work. And she had learned over and over that being good at the work was not always the thing that protected you. What protected you was documentation. What protected you was the email you sent at the right time to the right address. What protected you was the ability to stay calm in the room where someone was trying to end your career, and to leave that room without having given them anything they could use. She was at the nursing station for 40 minutes before Josie Tran appeared beside her with the expression of someone carrying information they weren't sure they should be carrying. "There are 2 men in the lobby," Josie said quietly. "Military. not patients. They asked for the charge nurse, and then they asked for the physician who treated the intake from this morning. Claire looked up from her documentation. Did they say who they were? They showed ID, Josie said. I didn't see it clearly, but one of them had, I think it was a JAG badge, like a legal officer. Claire was quiet for a moment. How's the Master Chief doing? She asked. Stable. Wound vitals are good. He's been asking for something. Keeps writing on the board they left in his room. Josie hesitated. He wrote the same name 4 times. Claire looked at her. Yours, Josie said. Claire set down her pen. Down the hall, she could hear the elevator doors open and the sound of dress shoes on linoleum, a sound that was specific and recognizable. The particular cadence of people who were used to walking into rooms and having them change. The 2 military officers turned the corner. They were in service dress blues. One was a lieutenant commander. The other wore the insignia of a Navy vice admiral, and he was looking at something in his hand, a document, folded once, with the expression of a man who had already made a decision and was simply following through on it. Renata Foss stepped out of the nursing station to greet them with the smile she reserved for people who outranked her assumptions. The vice admiral looked past her. I'm looking for the nurse, he said. Renata's smile didn't waver. I'm the charge nurse. I oversaw the patient's treatment this morning. No, the vice admiral said, in the flat, unhurried tone of someone who'd already reviewed the security footage. You weren't in the room. He looked down the corridor again. I'm looking for Claire Donovan. The hallway went very quiet. And somewhere down that corridor, in a room with a whiteboard still propped against the bedside rail, a decorated Navy Master Chief who hadn't voluntarily accepted medical contact from a stranger in 3 years was waiting for the only person in the building who'd thought to ask if it was okay first. Claire heard her name from 30 feet away and didn't move immediately. That was the thing nobody in that hallway understood. The half-second pause before she responded wasn't hesitation. It was the same calculation she'd run 100 times in noisier, more dangerous rooms than this one. Read the faces, read the body language, understand what you're walking into before you walk into it. The vice admiral was patient. The lieutenant commander beside him was scanning the corridor with the practiced neutrality of someone trained to observe without reacting. Renata Foss had gone very still in the way people went still when something was moving faster than they could manage it. Claire set her pen down and walked toward them. I'm Claire Donovan, she said. The vice admiral was somewhere in his late 50s, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had seen enough that very little registered on it anymore. He looked at her for a moment, the direct, appraising look that had nothing hostile in it, just assessment. And then he extended his hand. Vice Admiral Bernard Holt, he said. JAG sent Lieutenant Commander Vasquez. We need about 20 minutes of your time. I have a patient check at 3. We'll be done before 3, he said. It wasn't a promise so much as a statement of how things were going to go. Renata moved to insert herself. Admiral, I'm the charge nurse on this unit. If there are questions about this morning's incident I should be part of, we'll find you when we need you, Holt said without looking at her. He said it pleasantly enough. But there was a quality to pleasantness like that, the kind that had rank built into it at a molecular level, that made arguing feel like trying to push a wall. Renata stopped. They used the family consultation room off the main corridor, a small space with 4 chairs and a box of tissues on the table that always seemed slightly accusatory in its placement. Holt sat, Vasquez stood near the door, and Claire took the chair across from the Admiral without being asked. Master Chief Delbert Oakes has been in Navy service for 22 years, Holt said without preamble. He's been through 2 documented combat stress cycles and has been under a care management program through the VA for the past 18 months. He went AWOL from that program 6 weeks ago. He set a manila folder on the table but didn't open it. When he showed up at your ER this morning, his commanding officer's office notified us within the hour. We've been in contact with your hospital administrator. How's his wound? Claire asked. Holt paused. It was a brief pause, but she caught it, the slight recalibration of someone who'd expected a different first question. Stable. Dr. Webb says the wound management was appropriate. The concern is his stress response. He looked at her. The incident report we received described a nurse who entered the trauma bay against the charged nurse's explicit instruction and made unauthorized contact with a patient outside her assignment. That's Renata Foss's version, Claire said. I'm aware, Holt said. I've also reviewed the trauma bay security footage. The room was quiet. Vasquez, who hadn't spoken yet, opened a laptop on the table and turned it toward Claire without comment. The footage was from a ceiling-mounted camera, slightly washed out, the timestamp in the corner running in white numerals. The angle covered the full bay. You could see the moment Claire entered. You could see the position of every other person in the room. You could see exactly where Renata Foss was standing when the events in question took place. Outside the room, in the corridor, the whole time. We also have the written communication from your interaction with Master Chief Oakes, Vasquez said. He kept the whiteboard. He asked the nursing staff not to erase it. Claire absorbed that without showing anything. The charge nurse filed her incident report at 10:41 this morning, Holt said. What I want to understand is what happened in that room before the report was filed. So she told him. She told it the same way she'd written it, in sequence, without editorializing, with the particular precision of someone who understood that the value of an account was in its accuracy, not its drama. She described reading the intake chart flag. She described Renata's position in the corridor. She described the approach she'd taken with Oakes, the reasoning behind each step, the physical progression of how the encounter resolved. Vasquez typed. Holt listened without interrupting. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. The approach you used, Holt said, the grounding technique, the written communication, the pacing of physical approach, that's not in your nursing credentials. No, she said. Where's it from? She'd known this question was coming since the moment she'd seen the JAG badge. She'd had 8 months to decide how she was going to answer it if it ever came up, and she still wasn't entirely sure she'd made the right call. I spent 4 years as a combat medic before nursing school, she said, attached to special operations units. Part of that work was field stabilization for casualties with acute stress responses. You can't always medicate in those conditions. You learn to work with what you have. Holt looked at her steadily. Special operations support. Yes. Which unit? She held his gaze. The records are sealed. Another pause. Longer this time. Holt looked at Vasquez, and something passed between them that Claire couldn't read entirely, but she recognized the shape of it, the recognition of a variable they hadn't accounted for. All right, Holt said. He closed the folder. Master Chief Oakes has been asking for you since we arrived. His care team wants to do a full psychiatric assessment this afternoon, and he's declined 3 times. He'll only communicate with one person. He looked at her. We'd like your help. My help, Claire said. I'm currently suspended pending a termination review. I'm aware of that too, Holt said. The hospital administrator is aware that we're here? She understood what that meant without it needing to be spelled out. She'd spent enough time adjacent to institutional power structures to know how they moved, not loudly, but with weight. A vice admiral didn't show up at a civilian hospital for a routine patient visit. Something larger was in motion here, something she didn't have the full shape of yet. I'll help with the assessment, she said. Whatever happens after that, I'm not signing the separation agreement. Nobody's asking you to, Holt said. She went back to the nursing station first. Josie was there, pretending to update a chart with the attentiveness of someone who'd been watching the hallway for 20 minutes. Is it bad? Josie asked quietly. I don't know yet, Claire said honestly. She pulled the whiteboard marker from her pocket. She'd kept it, out of habit, when she'd left the trauma bay, and checked that it still had ink. Cover my 3 o'clock check if I'm not back. Already done, Josie said. She walked down to Oakes's room. He'd been moved to a single-occupancy room on the unit. Someone had made that call at some point, which was the right call, and she noted it as a small positive amid the mess of the morning. The room was dim, the blinds half closed. He was sitting up in the bed with the whiteboard on his lap and a marker in his hand, and the first thing she saw when she pushed the door open was that he'd filled the board with text he'd written himself. She couldn't read it from the doorway. She walked closer. He watched her come in with the same alert tracking she'd seen in the trauma bay, but calibrated differently now. She wasn't a stranger anymore. Not exactly. She was the one reference point he had in this building that had proven reliable, and she watched him make that calculation in real time, the way someone in a new country orients to the one landmark they recognize. She looked at the board. He'd written in a handwriting that was cramped and slightly unsteady, probably from the pain. "Why are you the only one who asked first?" She pulled the chair next to the bed and sat down. She took the marker from him without asking. She was already in his established trust zone, the rules were different now, and wrote on the lower half of the board. "Most people don't know how scared you were. They just saw big." He read it. His jaw moved. He took the marker back. "Scared is weakness." She took the marker. "Scared. In that situation is accurate. You were surrounded by people you couldn't hear, touching you without warning. Your threat response worked correctly." He stared at that for a long time. She let him. "They want to do a psych eval," he wrote finally. "I know. I'm asking you to let them. Last evil put me on medication that made me feel dead." She held that for a moment. This was the part that required honesty, not reassurance. She'd learned that particular lesson the hard way, from patients who'd figured out when they were being managed and withdrew completely. "That's a real problem, and you can say that to them. I can be in the room if you want. Nobody puts you on anything today without explaining it in writing first." "I'll make sure." He looked at her. "You got fired this morning." She blinked, then almost laughed. She didn't know how he'd found that out. Josie, probably, or the general atmosphere of a hospital unit, which had its own intelligence network that moved faster than any formal communication system. She took the marker. "Working on it." He almost smiled. It was a very small thing, barely a shift in the muscles around his eyes, but it was there. "Okay," he wrote, "but you stay in the room." She nodded. The psychiatric assessment was conducted by a Dr. Yolanda Merritt, a lean woman in her late 40s who had the particular patience of someone who'd spent a career working with populations that required it. She arrived with a VA consultation form and a tablet, took one look at Claire and Oakes's whiteboard system, and said, with the pragmatism of someone who'd learned not to be precious about methodology, "Do you want to translate, or should I write directly to him?" "I'll translate," Claire said. "He trusts the board system. Switching would reset us." Merritt nodded. "Fine." They spent 2 hours in that room. Merritt asked questions. Claire wrote them. Oakes wrote answers. Claire read them back. It was slow and occasionally clumsy. There were concepts that didn't compress well into board-sized text, moments where Oakes's writing became too small or too pressured when the questions touched something difficult. But it moved. It progressed. Claire managed the pace the way she'd managed the pace in the trauma bay, not by hurrying and not by stopping, but by staying in the space between them and keeping it from collapsing. At one point, Merritt asked about the medication history. Oakes wrote something on the board and then turned it away from Merritt so only Claire could read it. "The last doctor lied about the side effects. I read about them online after. He knew." Claire read it. Then she wrote below it, "Do you want me to tell her that, or do you want to show her?" He turned the board toward Merritt. The psychiatrist read it without reacting visibly, which was a form of professionalism Claire respected. She made a note on her tablet. She said, at a normal speaking pace that Claire translated into written form, "That's something we're going to address. I want the original prescription records before we talk about any current medication options." Oakes watched Claire write it. Then he wrote, "Okay, it wasn't resolution. It wasn't fixed. But it was a door that had been closed, opened a crack. By the time Merritt left at just after 5, the hallway outside was quieter. The shift had turned, the day crew was mostly gone, the unit settling into its evening rhythm. Claire walked out of Oakes's room and found Holt waiting in the corridor with the patience of someone who'd had a full afternoon to think about whatever he was about to say. "Doctor, Merritt says the assessment went well," he said, "better than it would have otherwise. She also said she's recommending a different care management approach than what Oakes has been under. Apparently there were some issues with his previous treatment record." "Apparently," Claire said. Holt looked at her for a moment. I put in a call to the hospital administrator an hour ago. The termination review has been paused pending investigation of the incident report. She absorbed that. Renata's report. The charge nurse's report, yes. He paused. I want to be straightforward with you. I don't have authority over civilian hospital personnel decisions. What I do have is a medical record that shows a patient with significant military care history who responded to intervention from one specific individual and a care team that's going to need coordination going forward. He chose his next words carefully. The Navy has an interest in Master Chief Oakes's treatment outcome. That interest extends to the staff involved in his care. It was indirect, but she'd spent enough time around indirect institutional language to translate it cleanly. He had leverage, and he was using it, and he was telling her so without saying so. How long is he here? She asked. Webb wants him for at least 2 weeks. The wound needs monitoring, and Merritt wants to start the new protocol in a supervised setting. Holt looked at her steadily. I'd like you involved in his daily care for the duration. Talk to the administrator, Claire said. I'm still technically suspended. I've already talked to the administrator, he said. And then, with the same quiet economy he'd used on Renata that morning. Go home. Get some sleep. Come back tomorrow. She drove home through the early Montana dark, the mountains invisible above the tree line, the temperature dropping fast the way it did out here after the sun went down. She had a small apartment 20 minutes from the hospital, functional, barely decorated, the kind of place that said clearly that she hadn't decided yet if she was staying. She made coffee she didn't need, sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, and spent an hour going through the hospital's publicly posted communication policies for nonverbal and hearing-impaired patients. There were 4 pages. None of them addressed acute trauma response. None of them mentioned deaf patients in crisis settings. There was a single line on page 3 about interpreter services available upon request, with a phone number that she suspected went to a translation service for spoken languages. She wrote up a 12-page gap analysis. It wasn't her job. She wasn't technically a hospital employee at this precise moment in any clearly defined sense. But she wrote it anyway, with the particular compulsion of someone who couldn't leave a structural problem sitting unfixed once they'd seen it. She attached it to an email, added Holt and Webb to the address line, and then paused before hitting send. She'd learned, in the service, that sending things at the right moment mattered as much as what you sent. Too soon, and it looked reactive. Too late, and it looked like afterthought. She sent it at 7:15 and went to bed. In the morning, she arrived at the hospital to find 3 things waiting for her. A badge access re-enabled at the front desk, a note from Dr. Webb asking her to join rounds on Oaks at 8, and Renata Foss standing in the corridor outside the nursing station with an expression that had gone from hostile to something more complicated and harder to read. They looked at each other for a moment. I heard the Admiral called the administrator, Renata said. I heard that too, Claire said. Renata's jaw moved. For a second, Claire thought she was going to say something that would change the shape of the morning. Then she turned and walked away without another word, and Claire watched her go with the measured attention of someone filing information rather than drawing conclusions. She went to rounds. Oakes was better. His color was clearer, the wound vitals were good, and he'd slept, which Merritt's notes indicated was significant given his history. He had the whiteboard propped against his knees when she came in, and he'd already written on it. What happened with your job? She wrote, still here, working on the rest. He wrote, good. The morning was ordinary in the way that mornings after crises often were. The acute tension gone, replaced by the slower burning effort of managing consequences. She did her rounds, managed her assignments, answered questions from Merritt's team about the communication protocol she'd developed with Oakes. Around 10:30, Josie found her at the nursing station with that same careful expression she'd had the day before. Someone from administration is in the conference room, Josie said. With Renata. Claire looked up. They've been in there for 40 minutes, Josie said, and the door's been closed the whole time. That was different. Closed-door administrative meetings with charge nurses on active units didn't happen spontaneously. They happened because something had been escalated, or because something was being formalized, or because someone had decided that a situation needed to be managed before it managed itself. She thought about the security footage on Vasquez's laptop, the timestamp in the corner, the angle that had covered the whole room. She thought about the 4 nurses she'd heard complaining in fragments over 8 months, about reassigned shifts, about documentation that didn't reflect what actually happened, about a charge nurse whose memory of events had a way of aligning with whatever version of events served her best. She went back to her work. She documented. She checked on Oakes at noon and found him working through a second session with Merritt's team, the whiteboard filling and erasing and filling again in the methodical cadence of actual clinical progress. At 2 in the afternoon, Sandra from HR appeared in the hallway. She didn't have the folder this time. She had a single sheet of paper and an expression that had nothing of the conference room neutrality from 2 days ago. She looked like someone who'd spent the morning being told that the situation she'd been managing was larger than she'd understood it to be. "Ms. Donovan," she said, "we need to speak." Claire capped her pen. "All right." "The termination review has been formally closed," Sandra said. "All disciplinary documentation from the incident has been removed from your file." She paused. "There's also an inquiry that's been opened into the incident report filed by the charge nurse. I'm not able to give you details, but I want you to know that the investigation is being taken seriously." Claire looked at her. "Is that all?" "The administrator would like a meeting with you tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. He'd like to discuss the communication protocol document you sent last night." She hadn't sent it to the administrator. She'd sent it to Holt and Webb, which meant one of them had forwarded it. She filed that information away without commenting on it. "I'll be there," she said. Sandra left. Josie appeared from around the corner of the supply alcove with the barely concealed energy of someone who'd been waiting for a debrief. "What did she say?" "Termination's off the table," Claire said. Josie exhaled. Okay, good. That's..." She caught herself. "What about Renata?" "Investigation's been opened," Claire said. "I don't know the details." Josie was quiet for a moment. There was something she wanted to say. Claire could see it, but she was parsing something, deciding something. "There are 3 other nurses who've filed informal complaints in the last 2 years," Josie said finally, "about documentation, about assignments being changed after the fact. 2 of them withdrew because they thought it wouldn't go anywhere." She met Claire's eyes. "If there's a formal investigation, they might want to know." Claire looked at her. "That's their decision to make." "I know," Josie said. "I just thought I thought you should know it's there." The afternoon was almost over. The unit had its end-of-shift rhythm. Charting, handoffs, the quiet sorting of what the day had produced. Claire finished her documentation at 5:45, checked Oakes's room one more time to find him asleep with the whiteboard still in his hands, and stood in the corridor for a moment in the particular stillness that comes when the worst of something is past, but the rest of it isn't done. She was almost at the exit when the charge nurse from the evening shift stopped her. "There's a message for you," the nurse said, handing her a folded piece of paper with the uncertain look of someone who wasn't sure what they were carrying. "Someone dropped it at the desk. No name." Claire unfolded it. It was a photocopy. A section of what looked like an internal administrative document, a care assignment log from 6 weeks ago, with dates, patient names, and notation codes. Several lines had been highlighted in yellow, and at the bottom, in pen, someone had written a single sentence. Oakes wasn't the first one they missed. She stood there in the corridor for a long moment, reading the highlighted lines again. 3 patients, 3 different dates. 3 notation codes that matched the same charge nurse's initials. And something in her chest went quiet and certain the way it did when she understood that what she'd thought was a problem with one morning was actually a problem with a very long time. She stood in that corridor for another 30 seconds, then folded the paper and put it in her scrub pocket. Not because she was dismissing it, because standing in a hospital hallway reading a document someone had slipped to her anonymously was not the right place to think through what it meant. She'd learned that particular discipline in the field, the ability to receive information that changed the shape of a situation and not let the change show on your face until you were somewhere you could afford to let it show. She drove home. She put the photocopy on the kitchen table under the lamp and read it properly this time. The care assignment log was a standard administrative form, the kind generated automatically by the hospital's patient management system, showing who had been assigned to whom, when, and with what priority coding. The highlighted lines were from 3 separate dates across a 6-week window ending 2 weeks before Oakes arrived. 3 patients, all with VA referral flags indicating military care history. 2 had combat trauma notations. All 3 had been assigned to junior nurses, then reassigned mid-shift. Then, and this was the part that made her look closely, their care notes had been amended after the fact. Not corrected. Amended. There was a difference, and it lived in the timestamp. Care notes were supposed to be written in real time or within 30 minutes of an event. These had been modified between 12 and 18 hours later. The modifications weren't flagged in the system the way they should have been, which meant either the person making them had administrative override access or someone had disabled the audit trail on those specific records. The notation codes at the end of each line included an initial pair she'd seen before in the nursing station paperwork. R.F. Renata Foss. She sat with that for a while. The coffee she'd made went cold. Outside, the wind came off the mountains and pushed against the window with the low persistence it had most of March, and she thought about what the document was and what it wasn't. What it was? Evidence of a pattern, or at least the shape of one. Amended records. Patients with military history. A charge nurse whose name was on every line. What it wasn't, proof of anything specific. She didn't know who had sent it, which meant she didn't know their motive or their reliability. She didn't know what the amendment said compared to the originals. She didn't know if the 3 patients had experienced harm or whether the documentation irregularities were the result of something more mundane than what the highlighted lines implied. What she knew, sitting at that table at 9:15 at night, was that she had to be careful. She'd seen what happened when someone brought accusations without sufficient grounding. She'd watched it from both sides. The person making the accusation whose credibility got torn apart before the substance was ever examined, and the institution that circled and protected and waited for the noise to die down. She was already in a position that looked, to anyone watching, like a nurse with an axe to grind against the charge nurse who'd tried to fire her. Any accusation she made in that context would get filtered through that lens immediately. She needed the original records. She needed the comparison between what the notes said before and after the amendments. She needed someone with the authority and the institutional access to pull those records in a way that didn't get buried. She thought about Holt. Then she thought about Webb. Then she put both of them aside, because this needed to go through the right channel the first time, or it wouldn't go through at all. She typed a careful, specific email to the hospital's internal compliance office, not the administrator, not HR, not anyone in the nursing chain of command, describing in precise terms the documentation she'd received and the specific concern it raised. She attached a scan of the photocopy. She noted that she was not making an allegation. She was flagging a pattern that warranted review. She requested that the original unmodified records be preserved before any further administrative action on the related files. She sent it at 9:42 and went to bed. The administrator's meeting the next morning was in a corner office on the 4th floor with a view of the mountains that Claire suspected nobody in that office actually looked at anymore. Administrator Dale Whitten was in his early 60s, with the careful grooming of a man who understood that appearance was a form of institutional communication. He had her gap analysis printed and in front of him, and he'd marked it up with a red pen, which she took as a positive sign. People who disagreed with documents didn't usually annotate them. 12 pages, he said, by way of opening. The gaps warranted it, she said. They do. He looked at the cover page for a moment. You wrote this the night after a full shift during which you were technically suspended. The problems don't stop because my shift did. He looked at her over the paper. It was a measuring look, the kind that was trying to determine if she was an asset or a liability, and understanding that the answer was probably both, and weighing which one was larger. I've spoken with Vice Admiral Holt, he said, and with Dr. Merritt, who says the Master Chief's assessment is progressing better than any comparable case she's managed in the last 4 years. He set the gap analysis down. I've also received a communication from the compliance office this morning about a documentation review request. She kept her face neutral. I'm not going to ask you about the specifics of that request, Whitten said. That's appropriate to the process. What I'm going to say is that we will cooperate fully with the review. He paused. Is there anything else you want to bring to my attention directly? The 3 nurses Josie Tran mentioned, she said. The ones who filed informal complaints and withdrew. If the review is going to be thorough, their accounts should be part of it. Witten made a note. Their participation would be voluntary. I know, but someone should ask them. He looked at her for a moment longer than the question required. Then he nodded. The conversation that followed was about the gap analysis, the specific policy changes it recommended, the training implications, the cost of implementing a proper communication protocol for deaf and nonverbal patients in trauma settings. Witten asked good questions, the kind that came from someone who'd read the document carefully rather than skimmed it. By the end of the hour, two things had been agreed in principle: a formal working group to develop the new protocol, and Claire's appointment to lead it on a provisional basis pending final review. She walked back to the unit without quite knowing how she felt about that. Satisfied wasn't the right word. It was more like the particular sensation of having done work that was hard and unglamorous and right, and having it begin to compound in the way that right work sometimes did, if you were patient and careful and didn't oversell it. Oakes was awake when she came in. He had the whiteboard, as always, but he'd also been given a tablet with a text-to-display app that Merritt's team had set up, which gave him more space to write. He was clearly more comfortable with the board. The tablet required an interface layer that introduced a half-second delay that seemed to frustrate him. But the fact that he was trying it was something. He wrote on the board, "They told me you might be leading some new training thing." "Possibly," she wrote back. "Hospital's still deciding." "They should decide yes," he wrote, "for what it's worth." She wrote, "It's worth something." He looked at that. Then, "When I first got here, I was ready to put someone through a wall." "I know. I haven't been okay in a while," he wrote. "I mean actually okay, not just managing." She sat with that, wrote carefully. That takes time. But the difference between managing and okay is real, and it's worth going after. He stared at what she'd written for a long moment. Then he set the marker down and looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone who was very tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She let the silence sit. That was the thing most people got wrong with patients like Oakes. They felt the silence as a failure, as a gap that needed filling, and they filled it with words that were really just noise dressed up as care. She let it sit because she'd learned that some things needed room to exist before they could move, and the worst thing you could do was crowd them. After a minute, he picked the marker back up and wrote, "Okay, I'm going to try." She nodded. That was enough. The investigation notification came through the compliance office 2 days later. Not to Claire, but the hospital was small enough and the unit tight enough that the information moved through it by the end of the first morning. The compliance review had been opened formally. The original patient records from the 3 flagged dates had been preserved and pulled for comparison, and an external audit firm had been contacted to handle the documentation analysis independently. Renata Foss had been placed on administrative leave effective immediately. The unit reacted to this in the way units reacted to things that were significant and complex, and that people weren't sure they were allowed to feel relieved about. There was a kind of muted, careful quality to the conversations at the nursing station. Not celebration, but the particular release of tension that came when something people had sensed for a long time was finally being looked at openly. Josie told her that 2 of the 3 nurses who'd filed informal complaints had already contacted HR to say they were willing to participate in the review. The 3rd hadn't responded yet, but Josie's expression suggested she thought they would. Claire did her work. She managed her patients, continued Oakes's daily communication sessions, and spent her evenings building the framework for the new trauma communication protocol with the kind of focused methodology that had always been her default mode when things around her were in flux. Work was the thing she knew how to control. Everything else was process. On the 6th day after Renata's leave began, she was in the middle of a care planning meeting for Oakes with Merritt and Webb when her pager, the hospital still used pagers on the trauma floor, a choice she'd always privately found absurd, went off with a priority code she'd only ever seen in drill scenarios. Mass casualty. Incoming. She was out of the room before Merritt finished her sentence. The information came in fragments on her way down the stairwell. A highway pileup on Route 12, 11 miles east, involving a commercial vehicle and multiple passenger cars. Initial reports said 8 to 12 casualties, several critical. The hospital's trauma capacity was about to be tested at a level it hadn't seen in over 2 years. The trauma bay was already in controlled chaos when she hit the floor. The good kind of chaos, the kind that had structure underneath it, people moving to assigned positions, equipment being checked, the overhead speaker running a calm, specific set of instructions from the charge, who'd stepped into Renata's role on an interim basis. The interim charge was a man named Roy Delacroix, a 15-year trauma nurse who was steady in a way that didn't announce itself, and he found Claire in the corridor with the directness of someone who'd already done his mental triage. "I need you on Bay 2, he said. "Incoming is a veteran, active military ID, combat trauma history flagged by the paramedics at scene. He's conscious but reportedly non-responsive to verbal contact." She looked at him. Non-responsive as in altered level of consciousness, or non-responsive as in not responding to anyone talking to him? Delacroix met her eyes. Paramedics said he's been that way since they arrived. No hearing aid found at scene. Possible hearing impairment, they're not sure. She grabbed a whiteboard from the supply cart. There were 3 of them now, in every trauma bay, by her specific recommendation and Witten's sign-off, and a fresh marker. What's his injury profile? Blunt chest trauma, possible rib fractures, laceration to the left forearm, query hemothorax, GCS is 14, vitals are holding. Stable enough to manage if they didn't waste time. Who's the attending? Webb's on Bay 1. You've got Dr. Preena Shastri on 2. Delacroix said it with a half-second of additional weight, because Shastri was competent but newer, 3 years out of residency. And this was going to require a specific kind of coordination. "I'll brief her on the approach," Claire said. "Already told her you were coming," he said, and turned to the next thing. The ambulance arrived 2 minutes later. The patient was a man in his late 30s, heavy-set, still in civilian clothes with blood at the left collar, and the particular stillness of someone who'd gone inward in a way that had nothing to do with unconsciousness. His eyes were open and tracking, but not the room. They were tracking something else, something internal, and Claire recognized the look immediately because she'd seen it across a whiteboard 3 weeks ago. She positioned herself in his sight line before anyone else moved toward him. The paramedic doing the handoff to Shastri was still talking when Claire held the board up. "My name is Claire. You are in a hospital. You are safe." His eyes found the board, stopped. Shastri looked at Claire, then at the patient, then at Claire again, with the quick recalibration of a physician smart enough to recognize when something was working that she didn't fully understand yet. "Keep doing that," Shastri said quietly, and turned to her team. "Let's get a chest X-ray portable, CBC, and start a large-bore IV on the right side. Nobody touches him without a written heads-up first." The next 40 minutes were some of the most technically demanding of Claire's career. Not because the patient was the most critically injured she'd handled, but because she was simultaneously managing his communication and coordinating between him and Shastri, translating medical intent into written form fast enough to maintain the clinical pace the chest injury required, while also reading his responses for signs of decompensation that might not show up in his vitals before they showed up in his behavior. His name, he wrote on the board with a hand she steadied, was Marcus Trail. He was not deaf. He had a dissociative response under stress that he'd apparently had since a deployment 3 years ago, during which he'd lost most of his hearing temporarily from a blast, and his nervous system had apparently kept that association locked in place even after his hearing returned. When he was scared enough, he stopped being able to process verbal input. Had stopped being able to process it, the first responders hadn't known, and so they'd spent 17 minutes at the scene talking at a man who couldn't hear them, which had made everything worse. She got a portable X-ray through by writing, "They need a picture of your chest. The machine is loud, but won't hurt." 45 seconds. He nodded. She got the IV placed by writing, "Left arm, back of the hand." 3 seconds. He held still. Shastri confirmed the hemothorax was small enough to manage without a chest drain if they monitored closely, which was a better outcome than the injury profile had initially suggested. By the time the acute phase was stabilizing, Trail was beginning to process spoken words again. She could see it in the way his responses to the room changed. the slight shift as auditory input started landing, and she started speaking to him directly while still writing simultaneously, giving him a bridge back. "You're doing well," she said. "The bleeding's under control." He looked at her, said with a voice that was rough from stress, and 3 weeks of probably not using it much. "You do this a lot?" "Getting better at it," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite humor, but recognition. She was at the nursing station at 8 that evening, writing her documentation, when Josie appeared beside her with a phone in her hand and an expression that had climbed several registers above her usual carefully maintained calm. "You need to see this," Josie said. She turned the phone. It was a local news website, the Delwood Courier, which covered the region in the dutiful, underfunded way of small city journalism. The headline read, "Vance Memorial Nursing Staff Complaint Prompts Multi-Patient Record Review." The article was careful and specific, quoting unnamed hospital sources and a statement from the compliance office confirming the audit was underway. It noted that the review involved patient records spanning an 18-month period and that the hospital had engaged an external auditing firm. It wasn't front page. It was halfway down the local news feed. But below the article, there were 3 comments. 2 were from people she didn't know, expressing vague support for veteran care quality. The third was a name she did know, Renata Foss's, posting from a public account, a statement that was 2 paragraphs long and very composed, and which began with the sentence, "The record review currently underway at Vance Memorial was initiated by a newly hired nurse with a personal grievance against me, and the hospital's failure to investigate the motivations behind that complaint is a serious institutional lapse." Claire read it twice. Then she handed the phone back. "That's going to complicate things," Josie said. "Maybe," Claire said. "She's saying you fabricated it, or at least implied it." "I know what she's saying. Are you going to respond?" "No," Claire said. Josie looked at her. "Shouldn't you—" "Responding to that statement publicly puts me in a public argument with her, which is exactly where she wants me." Claire set her pen down and turned to face Josie fully. "The audit firm has the original records. The compliance office has my documentation. The hospital's legal team is now certainly aware of a public statement made by an employee on administrative leave that contains characterizations of an active investigation." She paused. She just handed them a problem. Josie absorbed that. "You're not worried?" "I'm worried about plenty of things," Claire said. "That's not one of them." She went back to her documentation and finished it with the same precision she always brought to it, and she was almost done when the charge desk phone rang and Delacroix picked it up, said 3 words, and looked across the station at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. "It's Vice Admiral Holt," he said. "He says it's not about Oaks." She took the phone. "There's a situation," Holt said without preamble. His voice had the tone she was beginning to recognize, the one that appeared when the thing he was describing had already moved faster than the conversation catching up to it. "I'm going to need you to come in early tomorrow." "How early?" 5:30. A pause. "The 3 patients flagged in that compliance report. We've been running parallel checks on our end, cross-referencing with VA care records. We found a 4th. She was quiet. "The 4th patient is currently in the neurology ward of your hospital," Holt said. "He was admitted 6 days ago for what was documented as a routine post-surgical follow-up. His original admission notes from Vance show a care flag that was removed from his record sometime in the last 10 days. He paused again, and in the pause she could hear the weight of what he was about to say. The flag indicated he had information relevant to an active Navy Inspector General inquiry. The word removed sat in the air between them for a moment. "What kind of information?" Claire asked. "The kind that someone clearly didn't want in a hospital record," Holt said. "Which is why I need you there at 5:30, before rounds, before the administrative day starts." His voice shifted slightly. "And Claire, don't tell anyone about this call." She stood at the charge desk for a moment after she hung up, the phone still in her hand, looking at nothing in particular. Somewhere on the 4th floor of this building, in the neurology ward, a man was lying in a hospital bed with a gap in his medical record where something important used to be. And somewhere in the sequence of events that had started with a deaf master chief and a whiteboard and a charge nurse who'd tried to make her disappear, a thread had emerged that was longer and darker than she'd understood it to be. She set the phone down. She thought about the anonymous note. Oakes wasn't the first one they missed. She thought about the amended records. 3 patients. A pattern. 18 months. And now a 4th. With a flag that someone had removed, connected to a Navy investigation that someone had apparently decided was better off invisible. She picked up her bag and walked to the elevator, and she did not let herself think too far ahead of what she knew, because thinking ahead of what you knew was how people made mistakes, and she was not in a position to make mistakes. But in the elevator, alone, she let herself understand one thing cleanly. This had stopped being about her job the moment that note came under the nursing station door. The doors opened on the ground floor. She walked out into the Montana night, and the cold hit her face, and somewhere in the hospital behind her, a man with a gap in his record was sleeping through a night he probably didn't know was the last quiet one he was going to have. She set her alarm for 4:50 and didn't sleep well before it went off. Not anxiety exactly. She'd operated on worse rest in worse circumstances, and knew the difference between nerves and the body's reasonable refusal to switch off when it understood something significant was coming. She lay in the dark for a while, listening to the wind, and let her mind run through what she knew without trying to arrange it into a conclusion. Holt had said a flag had been removed. He'd said the patient had information relevant to a Navy IG inquiry. He hadn't said who removed the flag, or when, or whether it was connected to Renata Foss directly, or whether this was a different problem running adjacent to the first one. She got up at 4:40, made coffee, and drove to the hospital in the early Montana dark, where the roads were empty and the mountains were just a dark shape against a slightly less dark sky. Holt was already there when she arrived. He was in the corridor outside the neurology ward with Vasquez and a third person she hadn't seen before, a woman in civilian clothes who had the careful, observational stillness of someone from an investigative background. Not military, exactly. Something adjacent to it. "This is Agent Carla Dufresne," Holt said. "She's with the Navy Inspector General's office." Dufresne nodded at Claire with the economical acknowledgement of someone who'd already been briefed and didn't need the social scaffolding. "Vice Admiral Holt says you're the reason we still have a Master Chief to interview." "He's doing better," Claire said. "Good." She looked at the ward doors. "The patient in 411 is named Raymond Garrett. He's a retired Navy petty officer, 61 years old, admitted 6 days ago following a routine arterial repair that was part of a longer post-surgical recovery. He's ambulatory and cognitively intact." She paused. 8 months ago, Garrett filed a report with our office, alleging that clinical records for military patients at several VA-affiliated facilities in this region had been selectively altered to suppress adverse event documentation. His report named specific dates, specific patients, and specific personnel. Claire looked at her. "His report was logged and assigned to a field investigator," Dufresne continued. "That investigator was reassigned 3 months ago, and during the case transfer, the original flag linking Garrett's identity to the open inquiry was supposed to migrate to the new file. It didn't." She said this without visible emotion, which Claire suspected meant she felt it precisely, and had decided this was not the place. 6 days ago, Garrett's admission to this hospital triggered an automatic cross-reference in our system. We picked it up yesterday when we were running the parallel check on your compliance report. "The flag that was removed from his hospital record," Claire said. "Who removed it?" Dufresne looked at her steadily. "That's what we're here to establish." The access log for Garrett's electronic record would show every entry, every modification, every person who'd touched the file. Pulling it required hospital administration's cooperation, which Holt had already secured in a 6:50 a.m. phone call to Witten, who apparently took calls from vice admirals at any hour without complaint. The IT team was already running the extraction. They went in to see Garrett at 5:40. He was a compact man with close-cropped gray hair and the deliberate movements of someone managing post-surgical discomfort with practiced patience. He looked at Holt first, then Dufresne, then at Claire, with the slight additional attention of someone noting something unexpected. "Nurse," he said. "Yes," she said. "They usually send people in suits. He looked at Dufresne. No offense. None taken, Dufresne said. He shifted in the bed, wincing slightly at the movement. I filed that report 8 months ago, heard nothing. Then 3 weeks ago I get a call from someone at the hospital saying they're reviewing my care records and they need me to come in for a follow-up. He paused. That seemed fast, given the timeline. Who called you? Dufresne asked. Woman. Said she was a charge nurse. Reeves or Foss? Foss. He said the name with a flatness that suggested he'd thought about it more than once since. Said it was routine, post-surgical. I thought maybe it was. I came in. The silence in the room had a particular quality now. She called you personally, Dufresne said. She did. Garrett looked at his hands. I know how it sounds. Walk me through what happened when you were admitted, Dufresne said. He told it in the careful, factual way of someone who'd learned how to make a report. The intake process had been routine. He'd been settled into his room, connected to monitoring, given the standard post-procedural briefing. That evening, a nurse he didn't recognize had come in to update his chart. She'd spent several minutes at the bedside terminal, which he'd assumed was normal. I asked what she was updating, he said. She said it was billing codes. Didn't look up from the screen. Claire thought about the audit trail that the IT team was currently pulling. She thought about administrative override access and the specific kind of access a charge nurse on administrative leave might or might not retain. Renata Foss had been placed on leave 6 days ago. Garrett had been admitted 6 days ago. She looked at Holt. He was already looking at her with the expression of a man whose calculation had just been confirmed. I need to make a call, Dufresne said, and stepped into the corridor. Claire stayed. She moved to the chair beside Garrett's bed with the unhurried manner she used in patient rooms, not performing calm, just occupying the same space at the same pace. You've been waiting a long time for someone to take this seriously, she said. He looked at her sideways. 8 months. I'm sorry it took that long. He was quiet for a moment. There were 4 other patients in my report, people whose records I had reason to believe were altered. 2 of them. I never found out what happened to them. The system's not set up for you to follow up once you've filed. The compliance review has pulled records going back 18 months, she said. If they're in there, the audit will find them. He looked at her. You're the nurse they tried to fire. Word travels, she said. A friend on the floor told me. He studied her face. Why'd she go after you specifically? Claire thought about it honestly. Because I went into that room when she told me not to. That was enough. He nodded, slowly, like that made a particular kind of sense to him. The IT report came back at 7:15. Witten called Holt's cell directly, which meant the contents were significant enough that he wasn't waiting for a formal channel, and Holt stepped out of Garrett's room with Vasquez to take it. Claire did a medication check and stayed with Garrett, keeping the room settled because she understood that patients who were waiting on information they couldn't control needed the environment around them to be steady. Holt came back in 12 minutes with an expression that had shifted from the careful neutrality he'd maintained since the previous night. He looked at Garrett. Mr. Garrett, we have confirmation that your electronic record was accessed 6 days ago at 9:47 in the evening. The access was made using a charge nurse credential that should have been suspended when the employee was placed on administrative leave. There was a documentation flag in your file, a notation linking your name to an active IG inquiry, and it was deleted during that session. Garrett sat very still. I want to be direct with you, Holt continued. What was done to your record tonight is a federal offense. It's obstruction of a Navy Inspector General inquiry. The access log is time-stamped and authenticated. The employee in question is currently on administrative leave from this hospital, and as of this morning, we will be coordinating with civilian law enforcement to determine the appropriate next steps. The room held that for a moment. The other 4 patients in my report, Garrett said. His voice was level. You'll check them. They're already in our review queue, Dufresne said from the doorway. She'd come back in quietly. All of them. Garrett exhaled through his nose. Not quite relief, not quite grief, but something in the space where both of those things lived when they'd been held back a long time. He pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling and didn't say anything else for a moment. Claire didn't fill the silence. The morning moved fast after that. By 8 o'clock, Witten had been fully briefed by Dufresne and had made 2 calls, one to the hospital's legal counsel and one to the county sheriff's office, which was the appropriate civilian jurisdiction for the record's access issue. By 9, a deputy had arrived and was in a conference room with Dufresne and Vasquez going through the IT documentation. The unit found out in pieces the way units always found out about things. A deputy sheriff in a civilian hospital was not an invisible event. The administrative assistant on the 4th floor told someone on the 3rd floor, who told 2 people on the 2nd, and by the time Claire was doing her morning rounds, the nursing station had the particular charged quiet of a space where everyone knew something and nobody was sure what they were allowed to say about it. Josie found her at 10. They went to Renata's house, Josie said. Quiet, close. I heard from Sandra in HR, the deputy, and someone from the IG office. Okay, Claire said. She wasn't there. Josie's voice had something uncertain in it. She'd left. Apparently her neighbor said she had luggage. Claire stopped writing. That changed the texture of things. Someone who'd made a public statement 2 days ago about a personal grievance and institutional failure did not pack luggage and leave unless they understood that what was coming was larger than a statement could manage. Renata Foss had spent 8 months believing that the version of events she constructed was the version that would hold. The public comment, the incident report, the confidence with which she'd handed Claire the separation agreement, all of it had the quality of someone operating inside a story where they were certain of the ending. But she'd accessed a federal record. She'd deleted a flag tied to a Navy inquiry. And either she'd understood the weight of that the moment she did it, or she'd understood it 2 days ago when the compliance review went public, or she'd understood it this morning when a deputy showed up to find her gone. They'll find her, Claire said. You're not, I don't know, angry? Claire thought about that. Tired, she said. Tired is closer. She went back to her documentation. The full picture emerged across the next several hours in the incremental way that institutional investigations release their findings. Not in a revelation, but in accumulation. The audit firm's preliminary report, shared with Witten and Holt late that morning, showed that documentation irregularities in Renata Foss's unit stretched back not 18 months, but 26. 11 patients total. 9 had VA or active military designations. In 6 cases, the original care notes documented adverse events, delayed treatment, missed communication protocols, mishandled stress responses, that had been subsequently amended to reflect routine care. 3 of the 11 patients had filed informal complaints with the hospital. 2 had been discouraged from pursuing them formally. 1 had withdrawn after being told the process would take 6 to 8 months and would require them to remain available for follow-up interviews. Renata hadn't invented the system. She'd learned it, refined it, and operated inside it for long enough that it had started to look like ordinary institutional friction. The thing that had changed was Claire going into that room, not because it was heroic, because it was documented. Because Claire wrote things down with a precision that came from training in environments where documentation was the only thing that existed after the moment passed. Because she'd sent emails with timestamps, filed reports with specifics, forwarded gap analyses to people who had the authority and the interest to act on them. Because she'd understood, from the first day Renata had assigned her deadweight cases and stolen requisition supplies, that the defense against institutional erasure was a paper trail that couldn't be erased. Dr. Webb found her at noon in the break room, which was the first time she'd sat down since 4:50 in the morning. The audit report is going to the board next week, he said. He had the expression of a physician who'd just been handed information that was making him reconsider a significant chunk of the last 2 years. Were you aware of the scope before this morning? I had the shape of it, she said, not the full numbers. He was quiet. Some of those adverse events, the delayed treatment notes, there are patients whose outcomes I may need to review. He said it with the specific heaviness of a physician confronting the possibility that something in their care environment had been compromised without their knowledge. If the original notes documented delays that the amended versions don't show, then you were working off incomplete information, she said. That's what they were designed to do. It doesn't make me feel better. It's not supposed to, she said, but it's the accurate version. He looked at her for a long moment. The administrator is recommending you for the permanent protocol lead position. Full appointment, not provisional. She nodded. Is that a yes? It's a yes, she said. I need 10 more minutes of this coffee first. He almost smiled. Almost. He left her alone with it. Oakes's afternoon session was the steadiest she'd seen him. Merritt was there for part of it, running a structured review of his care management options going forward, and he engaged with it in a way that was different from the first session. Less defended, less braced. He still wrote most of his responses, even though his comfort with verbal exchange was returning, because the board had become the place where he felt like he was understood rather than managed. At one point, during a break in the session, he wrote, "What happened today?" She wrote back, "Big day. Can't tell you all of it yet. But things are moving the right direction. For you too? For me too." He nodded, and they left it there. Renata Foss was located by late afternoon. She hadn't fled, or hadn't gotten far enough to count as fleeing. She'd driven 4 hours to her sister's house in a town outside Billings, which the deputy's office established through a cell phone ping before she arrived. She was met at the door by a county officer and a federal agent from the IG office, who had a very specific set of questions about the evening of March 4th, a hospital computer terminal, and a record that no longer contained what it was supposed to contain. She didn't answer the questions. She asked for an attorney, which was her right, and the attorney arrived 3 hours later and had a private consultation with her before the formal interview began. What came out of the interview? In the summary Holt shared with Claire the following morning, with the careful precision of someone who was sharing what he could and flagging what he couldn't, was that Renata had made the access herself. She hadn't recruited anyone. She hadn't had assistants. She'd retained access to her charge nurse credentials because the IT department's process for suspending administrative leave accounts had a gap that nobody had closed. And she'd used it within hours of the compliance review going public, apparently operating under the belief that removing the IG flag from Garrett's record would break the chain of evidence connecting her documentation practices to a federal inquiry. It was, Holt said with the dry specificity of someone who'd seen a lot of bad decisions, the kind of move that made sense only if you didn't understand that federal record access was logged automatically at a server level that was separate from the hospital's own audit trail. She hadn't known. Or she'd known and panicked anyway. Either way, the access log existed. The deletion was documented. The timestamp matched her credential. The case had moved from a hospital compliance matter to a criminal referral in the space of 36 hours, and it was no longer something the hospital's legal team was managing. The U.S. Attorney's Office had been contacted. Claire received this information sitting in Witten's office at 7:30 in the morning with Holt and Dufresne present, and she listened to all of it and understood that the thing she'd been standing in the middle of for 3 weeks had been larger than she'd known from the beginning. "The 11 patients in the audit," she said, when Holt finished. "Are all of them being contacted?" "Dufresne's team is handling outreach," Holt said. "VA liaisons for the ones with active care records, direct contact for the others. Some of them have been carrying adverse outcomes they don't know have an explanation," she said. "That contact should be done carefully." "We know," Dufresne said. "I know you know. I'm saying it because I want it on record that I said it." Dufresne looked at her for a moment, and something in that look shifted very slightly. Not warmth exactly, but a recognition that had a particular quality. The recognition that passed between people who understood that saying the thing out loud mattered, even when everyone in the room already knew it. "It's on record," Dufresne said. The formal board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The preliminary audit report would be presented, the protocol changes would be proposed, and Witten would recommend Claire's permanent appointment before the board. It was institutional process, slow and formal and necessary, and she had 4 days to wait for it. She used them. She refined the protocol documentation. She ran 2 training sessions with the nursing staff, informal ones that Delacroix organized in the break room during shift overlaps, covering the communication approach she'd developed with Oakes and Trail, the theory behind it, the practical steps. People showed up. Not everyone, and not all of them were fully convinced, but enough of them that the room felt different from the nursing floor meetings she'd sat through for 8 months, where the correct response to everything had been to not speak unless spoken to. On the 3rd day, she was running through a practice scenario with 2 second-year nurses when a voice from the doorway said, Room for one more? She looked up. Master Chief Delbert Oakes was standing in the doorway in a hospital gown with a robe over it, his left arm still in a partial wrap, his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who had decided to do something and was committed to seeing it through regardless of how he felt about it. She looked at him. He shrugged his good shoulder and pointed at the whiteboard on the wall. She stepped back and gestured at the empty chair. He came in and sat down, and the 2 second-year nurses looked at him with the particular alertness of people who hadn't known he was coming and weren't sure what the correct response was. "He's going to help with the scenario," Claire said. "Master Chief, this is Keeley and Dennis. They're learning how to approach a patient who isn't responding to verbal contact." Oakes looked at them. Then he picked up the dry erase marker from the tray, uncapped it, and held it out to Keeley. She took it, uncertain. He made a writing gesture. She looked at Claire. "Write something," Claire said. Keeley turned to the board and wrote slightly awkwardly, "Hi, I'm Keeley. You're safe." Oakes looked at it. Then he nodded. Once, deliberate, and something in the room settled in a way that was hard to articulate, but that Claire felt clearly. That evening, after the session ended and Oakes had been walked back to his room by a nursing aide and the break room was empty, Josie found her there cleaning the whiteboard. "The board meeting's Tuesday," Josie said. "I know." "Renata's attorney filed a statement today saying she's cooperating with the federal inquiry." Claire kept wiping the board. "Is she?" "That's what the statement says." Josie sat on the edge of the table. "Do you think she'll actually... cooperating implies there's more to cooperate about." "It implies her attorney has done the math," Claire said. "That's not comforting." "It's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to be accurate." She set the eraser down. "If there's more, the investigation will find it. That's how investigations work." Josie was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about putting in for the charge nurse position. Interim, to start." Claire looked at her. "You should." "You think I'm ready?" "I think you've been doing most of the actual charge work for the last 3 weeks without the title," Claire said. "And I think you paid attention to the right things when it counted." Josie looked down at the table. Something moved across her face that she was trying not to let be as significant as it was. "Apply for it," Claire said. She picked up her bag and went back to the unit for final checks. She was at the nursing station at 9:50, finishing her last chart entry, when the elevator at the end of the corridor opened, and a man walked out who was not a patient, and not staff, and not anyone she recognized. He was in his late 40s, in a suit that had the particular quality of expensive but trying not to look at, carrying a legal folder. He looked at the nursing station, looked at the ward signs, and then looked at Claire with the specific attention of someone who'd been told what she looked like. "Claire Donovan?" he said. "Yes." He set the folder on the counter in front of her. "My name is Gerald Spears. I'm legal counsel for Renata Foss." He said it with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd delivered unwelcome folders many times. "My client has asked me to ensure you receive this personally." She looked at the folder but didn't open it. "What is it?" she said. "A civil complaint," he said. "Filed this afternoon in Gallatin County District Court. My client is alleging defamation, tortious interference with employment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." He paused. "She is seeking damages in the amount of $400,000. The nursing station was very quiet. Spires picked up his own briefcase. "You'll be formally served in the next 48 hours. I'd recommend retaining counsel." He looked at her with the mild professionalism of a man who was doing his job and had made a reasonable peace with what that job required. "Good evening." He walked back to the elevator. Claire looked at the folder on the counter. She looked at it for a long moment with the particular stillness of someone who was doing a very fast calculation and working hard not to let the outcome of that calculation show on her face in a nursing station where 3 people could see her. A woman facing federal criminal charges for obstruction of a Navy IG inquiry had just filed a civil suit against the nurse whose compliance report had triggered the investigation. Either Renata Foss was more desperate than she'd appeared, or her attorney had a strategy Claire didn't yet understand, or there was something in the situation that neither of them could see clearly from where they were standing. She picked up the folder. She thought about the access log, the deleted flag. the 26 months of amended records, the 11 patients, the U.S. Attorney's Office. And then she thought about one thing more. A civil complaint filed in a public court created a public record. A public record meant discovery. And discovery, for a defendant in a civil case, meant the right to request every document, every communication, every email and memo and internal note relevant to the claims being made, including documents that the plaintiff might not have realized she'd just made available. She picked up her phone and opened her contacts. She needed a lawyer, but she needed the right one. Someone who understood that what Renata Foss had just handed her was not a threat. It was an opening. The lawyer she called was named Patricia Odom. She'd found the name 3 weeks earlier, completely by accident, while reading through the hospital's posted patient rights documentation during one of her late evenings in the break room. Odom's firm was listed as a resource for employees involved in military medical care disputes, a small notation at the bottom of a page that most people would have scrolled past. Claire had written the number in the back of her notebook the way she wrote down everything that might matter later, without knowing yet if it would. Odom picked up on the third ring, which at 9:58 at night said something about how she operated. Claire told her what had happened in 60 seconds flat. No editorializing, just the facts in sequence. The compliance report, the federal inquiry, the criminal referral, and the civil complaint delivered 20 minutes ago by a lawyer in a good suit. There was a brief silence. She filed a civil suit, Odom said. Not a question. The tone of someone confirming they'd heard something correctly because it was remarkable. This afternoon, Gallatin County, while facing federal obstruction charges. Her attorney didn't mention that as a contradiction. No, Odom said. He wouldn't. A pause. Can you be in my office tomorrow at 7? Yes. Bring the folder. Bring everything you've documented since this started. Every email, every report, every timestamp. She paused again. Miss Donovan, whoever told her this was a good idea, either doesn't understand what discovery looks like in a case with federal parallel proceedings, or they do understand and they're hoping you don't. I'm starting to understand, Claire said. Good. 7 o'clock. She hung up and stood in the corridor for a moment, then went back to finish her charts. Odom's office was 4 blocks from the hospital, on the second floor of a building that had been a bank in a previous life and still had the solid, unhurried quality of a place built to hold things that mattered. Odom herself was in her mid-50s, compact, with reading glasses she took off and put back on, in a rhythm that seemed to correspond to when she was thinking versus when she was deciding. She read the civil complaint in 11 minutes. Claire timed it without meaning to. Defamation requires a false statement of fact published to a third party, Odom said, setting the complaint down. What did you publish? A compliance report to the hospital's internal compliance office, an email to hospital administration, a gap analysis on patient communication protocols. Were any of those statements false? No. Can you document that they weren't false? Yes. Odom made a note. Tortious interference requires that you intentionally induced a third party to breach a contract with her. The third party being the hospital, the contract being her employment. She looked at Claire over her glasses. Did you contact the hospital administration and ask them to take any specific action regarding her employment? I filed a compliance report about documentation irregularities. I didn't recommend her termination or her suspension. That distinction is going to matter. Another note. The IIED claim, intentional infliction of emotional distress, requires conduct so extreme and outrageous that it goes beyond all possible bounds of decency. She looked at the complaint again. They're characterizing your compliance report as a targeted campaign of harassment. I filed one report, Claire said. The federal investigation came from a separate inquiry that was already open. Right. Odom set the glasses down entirely and looked at her directly. Here's what I want you to understand about this suit. It is not strong. The evidentiary bar for each of these claims is high, and the facts as you've described them don't come close to meeting it. What the suit does is put pressure on you personally, legal costs, time, stress, in the hope that you'll agree to some form of settlement that includes a non-disclosure agreement and effectively silences your participation in the federal proceedings. The room was very quiet. She needs me quiet, Claire said. Her attorney needs the federal case to have as few cooperative witnesses as possible. Odom's voice was precise, but not cold. If you've documented communications with federal investigators, if you're listed as a material witness in the IG inquiry, a civil settlement with an NDA creates a complication for that testimony. She paused. It won't necessarily prevent it. Federal testimony supersedes civil ND, as in most circumstances, but it creates noise, and noise is what they're buying. So what do? We file a motion to dismiss on all 3 counts, which I'm confident will win. We simultaneously file a counterclaim for malicious prosecution because this suit was filed without probable cause and with the purpose of suppressing legitimate conduct. Odom picked up her pen. And we make sure that every document produced in discovery, every email she sent, every modification she's made to a record, every communication with her attorney about the timing of this filing, becomes part of the federal record. Claire looked at her. You think there's more? I think a person who accesses a federal record and deletes evidence while on administrative leave, and then files a civil suit 3 days after a criminal referral is made, is not operating from a position of confidence. Odom's expression was measured. I think she's scared, and scared people make decisions that seem logical to them in the moment and catastrophic in retrospect. The motion to dismiss was filed by end of week. Odom was right. It moved faster than civil motions usually moved, partly because the judge assigned to the case had reviewed the parallel federal proceedings and understood the landscape, and partly because the complaint's legal foundation was genuinely thin. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, the world kept moving. The board meeting on Tuesday went the way Witten had indicated it would. The audit report was presented in full. 26 months, 11 patients, a pattern of documentation manipulation that the external firm characterized as systematic rather than incidental. The board received it with the kind of institutional gravity that large, uncomfortable truths generated when they finally arrived in the right room. Not shock exactly, because the shape of it had been visible for days, but the particular weight of formal acknowledgement. Claire's appointment as protocol development lead was ratified unanimously. The new trauma communication standard was formally adopted as hospital policy, effective immediately, with a mandatory training rollout across all clinical units beginning the following month. Josie Tran was appointed interim charge nurse. She showed up at Claire's office, a small room off the unit that had previously been used for supply overflow, the afternoon after the board meeting, still wearing the lanyard with the new credential badge, with an expression that was trying to be professional and not quite managing it. I cried in the parking lot, Josie said. That's a normal response, Claire said. Is it? You've been holding a unit together for 3 weeks while everything around it was on fire. Yes, it's normal. Josie sat down in the extra chair. She was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was working up to something. 2 of the nurses who withdrew their complaints have formally refiled, she said. HR told me this morning. The 3rd one called yesterday and said she's thinking about it. Good. The families of 2 of the 11 patients are requesting meetings with administration. Josie looked at her hands. One of them, a patient from 14 months ago, there was a delayed treatment situation. He died 4 months later. His daughter wants to know if what's in the audit is connected. Claire looked at the wall for a moment. That's going to be a hard meeting. Yeah. Josie's voice was quiet. Webb's going to be there, and legal, but they asked if you would be there too. Why me? Because she read the Delwood Courier article. She knows you're the one who found it. Josie met her eyes. She said she wants to be in the room with someone who wasn't trying to protect the institution. Claire thought about that, about a daughter who'd spent 14 months with a version of events that might have had pieces missing, about what it meant to be handed a corrected version, not a better outcome. Nothing could produce that, but an accurate account of what had happened and why. I'll be there, she said. Master Chief Oakes was discharged on a Thursday morning, 3.5 weeks after he'd arrived. Merritt's team had established a new care management structure through the VA, with a communication protocol built into every appointment going forward and a specific flag in his file that required written confirmation of every medication change before it was administered. It wasn't a cure. It was a framework. The difference between a patient who was managed and a patient who had some measure of control over how they were managed. He came to say goodbye in the standard way of patients who weren't sure how to do that, showing up in the doorway of Claire's office with his discharge folder in one hand and the whiteboard marker in the other, because he'd apparently pocketed it at some point, and nobody had noticed. She looked at the marker. He looked at the marker. He set it on her desk without comment. She wrote on the whiteboard still mounted on her office wall, "Come back if you need to, and not just for medical reasons." He read it, picked up a pen from her desk, an actual pen, not the marker, and wrote on the corner of his discharge folder, "I know where to find you." He left. She stood in the office for a moment after he was gone, looking at the whiteboard. Then she went back to work. The civil suit hearing was on a Wednesday. Odom had told her she didn't need to attend. Motions to dismiss were procedural, argued by counsel, and Claire's presence wasn't required. Claire went anyway, not because she thought her attendance would change anything, but because she'd learned, over a career of being in difficult rooms, that choosing to be present when you were allowed to be absent was a form of statement that didn't require words. The courtroom was small and functional, the kind that handled civil motions on a calendar, that moved at a pace entirely indifferent to the significance any individual case held for the people involved in it. Renata Foss was there with Spears, and a second attorney Claire didn't recognize. She looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the setting and everything to do with what Claire suspected was the beginning of understanding the full dimensions of what she'd set in motion. Renata looked at Claire once when she came in. Claire looked back. That was all. The hearing took 40 minutes. The judge asked Spears pointed questions about the factual basis for the defamation claim and received answers that, in Claire's assessment, did not improve in quality under scrutiny. He asked about the timeline of the filing relative to the federal criminal referral and received an answer about unrelated parallel legal processes that the judge received with a visible patience that was not quite neutrality. The motion to dismiss was granted on all three counts. The judge, before closing the matter, made a comment from the bench that was not legally required, but that she apparently felt the record warranted. She noted that the complaint appeared to have been filed without adequate evidentiary basis, and that the timing suggested motivations inconsistent with good faith litigation. She did not use the word malicious. She used a phrase that meant the same thing in a language that would appear in a legal record. Odom filed the counterclaim for malicious prosecution that afternoon. The federal proceedings moved on their own timeline, separate from the civil matter, and with the particular momentum of institutional processes that had acquired enough documented evidence to be largely self-sustaining. The U.S. Attorney's Office confirmed charges in the fourth week: obstruction of a federal investigation and unauthorized access to protected records, and Renata Foss's attorney negotiated a guilty plea on the lesser charge in exchange for full cooperation with the broader IG inquiry into documentation practices across VA-affiliated facilities in the region. The cooperation produced what Dufresne had suspected it might: 2 additional facilities, 8 additional patient records flagged for review, and the confirmation that the practice of amending adverse event documentation had been discussed, at some point, between Renata and a former administrator at a different hospital who had since retired and moved out of state. It was not a conspiracy in the formal architectural sense. It was more like a shared understanding among people who'd discovered that a certain kind of paperwork could be managed, and that the people most likely to suffer from that management were the ones with the least institutional standing to push back. Veterans with complicated care histories, patients who moved through the system without advocates, people who complained and were told the process would take 6 to 8 months and quietly went away. The public statement from the U.S. Attorney's Office described the plea as part of a broader accountability initiative. It named Vance Memorial Military Medical Center as a cooperating institution. It named the compliance report filed in March as the trigger for the investigation. It did not name Claire Donovan, but it didn't need to. Raymond Garrett read the statement from his room at his sister's house in Billings, where he'd been recovering since his discharge, and called the hospital to ask for Claire. She took the call at the nursing station, standing up because there was nowhere to sit. 8 months, he said. I know. I thought it was going to disappear. That's what happens. You file something and it disappears. It didn't disappear, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The other patients they found at the other facilities, I don't have details on them, she said, but they're in the review. That's something. His voice had the particular texture of a man recalibrating what he'd believed about how things worked. I didn't think a nurse I'd never met was going to be the one to actually... He stopped, started again. I filed that report because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't have any authority. I didn't have access to anything. I wrote down what I saw and sent it to the right address and hoped. That's what it took, she said. That was enough. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, thank you. She didn't deflect it. She'd learned that deflecting gratitude was its own kind of dismissal, a way of saying the thing you did wasn't worth acknowledging, which was rarely true and often unkind. You're welcome, she said. Take care of yourself, Mr. Garrett. The training rollout started the first Monday of the following month. 8 sessions across 3 weeks, covering all shifts, all clinical units. Claire ran them herself, with Josie co-facilitating the nursing-specific components and Dr. Merritt contributing 2 sessions on acute stress response recognition. She'd designed the training the way she'd approached everything since March. Start with what people got wrong and why, not because she was trying to shame anyone, but because the gap between what people thought they were doing and what they were actually doing was the only place where real change could begin. She showed them the trauma bay footage. Witten had approved its use as a training resource, patient privacy protections in place. She showed them the before and after, what the room looked like when people were shouting at a man who couldn't hear them, and what it looked like after. She didn't narrate it. She let people sit with it. The first session had an emergency medicine resident in the back row who'd been resistant for the first 20 minutes. The particular resistance of someone who felt their existing competence was being questioned, who went very quiet when the footage played, who stayed after the session ended, who asked 2 specific good questions about application in pediatric patients, and then said, on his way out, I didn't know I was doing that wrong. Most people don't, she said. That's the point. Oak sent her a message through the VA patient portal 3 months after his discharge. The portal had a text function that his care coordinator had set up, partly because Merritt had flagged it as important to maintain his communication comfort. He wrote, first appointment with new team. They had a whiteboard in the room already. She read it at her desk and sat with it for a moment. Then she wrote back, how did it go? His response took a day. Okay. Actually okay. She thought about what she'd written to him in his hospital room, that the difference between managing and okay was real and worth going after. She thought about how easy it was to say that and how long and unglamorous the distance between those 2 things actually was in practice. She wrote, keep going. He wrote back, you too. The meeting with the daughter of the patient who had died, her name was Sylvie Marchand, she was 34, she'd driven up from Bozeman, was on a Tuesday in a conference room on the 3rd floor. Witten was there, and Webb, and a member of the hospital's legal team, and Claire. Sylvie Marchand was not what Claire had expected, which she recognized as a failure of her own assumptions. She'd expected grief, and grief was there, but the dominant quality in the room was a kind of focused, practical need to understand. Sylvie had brought a folder. She had written questions on a legal pad. She was not there to be comforted. She was there to know what had happened to her father. Webb walked her through the medical timeline with honesty that cost him something. Claire could see it in the way he spoke. The slight, deliberate quality of a man who was making himself say the thing that was hard to say. The original care notes had documented a delay in wound assessment during her father's second admission. The amended notes had not. Whether the delay had directly contributed to the cascade that led to his death was something the medical review was ongoing on, and Webb said so plainly rather than softening it into ambiguity. Sylvie listened. She wrote things down. When Webb finished, she looked at Claire. You didn't know my father, she said. No. But you're the one who found the pattern. The pattern was there to find, Claire said. Someone had to be looking at the right records. Sylvie looked at her for a long moment. I spent 14 months thinking my father's death was just bad luck, a complication, that it was nobody's fault because sometimes it isn't. Her voice was steady. I need to know that someone is going to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else's father. That's what the protocol is for, Claire said. That's what the training is for. It doesn't give you what you lost, but it changes what comes next. Sylvie looked down at her notes. Then she nodded. A single, deliberate movement, the kind that meant the person making it had decided something and was done deciding. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't resolution in the way stories were supposed to resolve. Her father was still gone, and no amount of policy change altered that. But something in the room had shifted to a place where the truth existed between them without apology or avoidance. And Claire had learned, over years in rooms like this, that sometimes that was the most honest thing you could offer anyone. 6 months after the morning she'd walked into a trauma bay with a whiteboard and a marker, Claire Donovan sat in her office at the end of a Wednesday shift and looked at the wall. The wall now had 3 things on it, the whiteboard, still there. A printed copy of the new hospital communication protocol, her name in the header as lead developer, and a photograph that Josie had taken without telling her and then printed and left on her desk without explanation. The training session where Oakes had sat in the chair and handed the marker to a second-year nurse named Keeley, and Keeley had turned to the board and written her first deliberate, careful, imperfect attempt to reach someone who couldn't hear her. She wasn't in the photograph. She was the one Josie had cropped out to fit the frame. But she'd been standing just to the left of the image's edge, watching it happen. That was close enough. She'd spent a career being underestimated by people who looked at her quiet competence and read it as absence, as someone who wasn't fully there, wasn't truly capable, wasn't worth the space she occupied. She'd learned, slowly and imperfectly and not without cost, that the answer to that was never to get louder. It was to stay in the room, document, build a record that couldn't be argued with, show up in the moments that mattered with the tools you'd spent years learning to use, and let the work speak in a register that outlasted whatever anyone chose to say about you. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't always feel like enough in the middle of it. There were nights, in the worst stretch of it, when she'd sat at her kitchen table at 11 o'clock looking at a compliance report and felt the specific grinding exhaustion of being right in a system that was not yet ready to acknowledge it. But she'd sent the email, she'd pushed the paper back, she'd walked into the room. And somewhere in this hospital right now, a veteran she'd never met was receiving care under a protocol that existed because she had. And a nurse she'd trained was standing at a bedside with a whiteboard instead of raised hands. And a man who'd spent years being managed was learning what it felt like to be asked first. She turned off the office light, walked down the corridor, checked her last patient of the day, a new intake, a young veteran, 23 years old, blast injury, partial hearing loss in the left ear, admitted that afternoon with a care flag that the intake nurse had caught and properly documented because the training had happened and the system had changed, and the people inside it were beginning to understand that the patient in front of them was a person, not a problem to root. She stood in the doorway. He was awake, watching the ceiling with the flat, removed expression of someone who didn't quite know where they were yet. She picked up the whiteboard from the supply hook beside the door, walked in, set it in his line of sight, wrote, "My name is Claire. Nothing happens here until you understand it and say it's okay." He looked at the board, looked at her. Something in his face, that particular guard that goes up when you don't know if the room you're in is safe, shifted by a fraction. He gave a small nod. She pulled up a chair. That was where it started. Not with authority, not with credentials, not with the noise of a system announcing itself. It started with one person choosing to slow down long enough to ask. It started with the understanding that being heard wasn't a privilege you extended to patients when it was convenient. It was the baseline, the floor, the first obligation of anyone who walked into a room with the power to help and the choice about how to use it. She'd been told she didn't belong in trauma. She'd been handed a separation agreement and shown the door. She'd been sued for doing her job correctly by someone who'd built a career on the assumption that the people most harmed by institutional failure were also the least equipped to survive it. Every one of those things had been true, for a moment, in a room where the wrong people held the wrong assumptions. And every one of them had been answered, not with confrontation, not with a speech, but with the patient, accumulated, unignorable weight of doing the right thing in writing, on time, for the right reasons, until the record spoke for itself and the room had no choice but to listen. She stayed until he fell asleep. Then she turned off his light, set the whiteboard on the hook for the morning nurse, and walked out into the corridor where the night shift was beginning, where the work continued, where the next room and the next patient and the next moment were already waiting. She went to meet them. Went to meet